Morgan Freeman settled into his first-class seat, adjusting his signature fedora as the hum of the aircraft filled the luxurious cabin. The flight from Los Angeles to New York was supposed to be a smooth ride, another routine trip for the Hollywood legend. He pulled out his leather-bound notebook, a habit he had picked up over the years for jotting down thoughts that could later transform into powerful narrations. Just as he was about to put pen to paper, a sharp voice interrupted his moment of peace. "Excuse me, sir," said an air hostess with a forced smile. "I believe you're in the wrong seat." Morgan looked up, his deep brown eyes calm but questioning. "I don't think so, young lady. 3A first class. That's my seat." Her smile tightened. "I'm sorry, but we have no record of a Mr. Freeman in first class." She glanced at the boarding pass in his hand but barely looked at it before shaking her head. Morgan sighed, tilting his head. "That's odd. Perhaps there's a mistake." The air hostess, whose name tag read Lindsay, crossed her arms. "I'm afraid I need you to move to economy, sir." The passengers in the surrounding seats turned their heads. A few whispers started to float around. A man in a business suit frowned, clearly recognizing the actor. An elderly woman a row behind gasped softly. Morgan chuckled, thinking it was a misunderstanding. "Young lady, I believe I paid for this seat. Would you kindly double-check your records?" Lindsay's expression turned impatient. "I already did, sir. I need you to move now." Morgan's face lost its amusement. He had been treated with respect his entire life, but something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just a clerical error, it was something deeper. He took a deep breath, carefully placing his notebook on the tray table. "I'd like to speak to the flight supervisor," he said, his voice still composed. Lindsay scoffed. "Sir, I don't think that's necessary. You're holding up the boarding process." By now, the entire first-class cabin was watching. Someone in the economy section had taken out their phone, recording the unfolding drama. Morgan glanced around, noticing the unease in the air. He had seen this kind of situation before, though rarely directed at him. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down. "Very well," he said finally, unbuckling his seatbelt. "If that's how you want it." Lindsay gave a curt nod, turning on her heel as if she had won a small victory. Morgan stood up, picked up his small carry-on bag, and slowly made his way down the aisle toward economy class. The murmur of whispers followed him like a shadow. What happened next, however, would change everything, and leave Lindsay in tears. Lindsay exhaled in relief as Morgan Freeman disappeared down the aisle. She had dealt with entitled passengers before, business executives who thought the world revolved around them, celebrities who expected royal treatment. To her, he was just another man who needed to follow the rules. She turned back toward the first-class cabin, only to be met with silent, disapproving stares. The businessman in 2C shook his head. "You do realize who that was, don't you?" Lindsay folded her arms, defensive. "It doesn't matter who he is. If his name isn't on the list, he can't sit here." The elderly woman behind the businessman frowned. "That man is a national treasure." A younger woman, who had been scrolling through her phone, tapped her screen. You just kicked out Morgan Freeman. And guess what? People in economy recorded the whole thing." She turned her phone around, revealing a trending post on social media. Lindsay's stomach sank. "What?" But before she could react, the flight supervisor, Karen Matthews, a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, stormed down the aisle. Her short blonde bob swayed as she walked, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin. "What's going on?" she demanded. The businessman wasted no time. "Your flight attendant just kicked Morgan Freeman out of first class." Karen's eyes widened in horror. "What? Why?" Lindsay straightened. "His name wasn't on the first-class manifest." Karen's face turned red. She pulled out her tablet, quickly scrolling through the passenger list. Within seconds, her entire demeanor changed. Her lips parted, and she inhaled sharply. "Oh my God," she whispered. Lindsay took a nervous step forward. "Ma'am." Karen's jaw clenched. She turned the screen toward Lindsay, her finger pointing at the name. "Seat 3A Morgan Freeman." Lindsay's heart stopped. The realization hit like a crashing wave. She hadn't even properly checked the list. She had assumed. She had made a mistake. A terrible, humiliating mistake. Karen shot her a glare so sharp it could cut through steel. Where is he? Lindsay swallowed hard. I sent him to economy. The businessman snorted. Unbelievable. Karen spun on her heel and marched toward the economy cabin. Lindsay hesitated, but followed, her legs suddenly feeling like lead. As they reached the back of the plane, they spotted him. Morgan Freeman was now seated in a cramped middle seat between a nervous college student and a tired mother holding a baby. His long legs barely had space. Yet, despite the discomfort, he sat there calm, flipping through the pages of his notebook as if nothing had happened. Karen approached carefully, her face pale. Mr. Freeman. He looked up, his deep, soothing voice filling the space. Ah, so you found me. Karen's hands twisted together. I am so terribly sorry. There was a mix-up. You are absolutely supposed to be in first class. Please, let us escort you back immediately. Morgan closed his notebook slowly. A mix-up, you say? Karen nodded quickly. Yes, sir. A regrettable one. Morgan studied her. Then his eyes flickered to Lindsay, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Lindsay couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. He exhaled and placed a gentle hand on the armrest. Tell me something, young lady, he said, directing his words toward Lindsay. When you saw me sitting there, did you assume I didn't belong? Lindsay's throat went dry. She knew the answer. She also knew she couldn't say it aloud. Karen looked furious. Mr. Freeman, we sincerely apologize for the unacceptable treatment you received. We would like to. Morgan held up a hand. I'm not interested in apologies. I'm interested in lessons. Lindsay felt the weight of his words. What happened next would shake her to her core. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers in economy were now whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between Morgan Freeman and the two flight attendants standing before him. Karen Matthews, the flight supervisor, was shifting uncomfortably, trying to maintain professionalism while also panicking over the situation. Lindsay, on the other hand, looked like she had swallowed a rock. Morgan Freeman's gaze was steady, unshaken. His voice was calm, yet carried the weight of a man who had seen the world for what it was. I don't need a fancy seat, he said, leaning back in the cramped economy chair. I've sat in places far less comfortable than this. His eyes locked onto Lindsay's. What I need to know is, why did you assume I wasn't supposed to be there? Lindsay felt the walls closing in. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The answer was obvious and everyone on that plane knew it. But saying it? That was different. Karen cleared her throat. Mr. Freeman, we deeply regret this. Morgan raised a hand. Let her speak. Lindsay's chest tightened. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She had been trained to follow procedures, to handle difficult passengers, to de-escalate conflicts. But nothing in her training had prepared her for this moment, for the simple, piercing honesty of being confronted by Morgan Freeman himself. I didn't check properly, she admitted, barely above a whisper. Morgan tilted his head. That's not the whole truth. A hushed silence spread over the cabin. Lindsay took a shaky breath. She was about to say something, but Morgan continued, his voice as smooth as ever. I've been around long enough to recognize patterns. I know when someone sees me as a man of value and when they see me as a man out of place. He clasped his hands together. You didn't see Morgan Freeman, Academy Award-winning actor. You saw someone who, in your mind, couldn't possibly belong in first class. Lindsay's face burned. I didn't mean, she started, but Morgan held up a hand again. I'm not looking for an apology. I just want you to think, he said, his voice softer now. You're young. You have a whole life ahead of you. But if you don't check your assumptions, you'll find yourself making mistakes far greater than this one. The mother sitting next to him adjusted her baby. Her eyes filled with admiration. The college student on his other side gulped, as if absorbing a life lesson himself. Karen Matthews, who had been nervously watching the exchange, decided it was time to step in. "Mr. Freeman, we understand if you're upset. We would be honored if you allowed us to escort you back to first class." Morgan glanced at his small notebook, then at the crying baby in the mother's arms. He smiled. "No, I think I'll stay right here." Lindsay's eyes widened. "But, sir," Morgan chuckled, "I paid for a first-class experience, but this," he gestured to the cramped economy row, "this is an experience too. Besides, I've made a friend." He nodded at the baby, who had stopped fussing and was now staring up at him in wide-eyed wonder. The passengers chuckled. A few even clapped lightly. Karen, still horrified by the situation, turned to Lindsay with an expression that said, "You are going to regret this later." Lindsay swallowed hard, looking down at her hands. The weight of her actions, the viral video already circulating online, and the lesson she had just been given, everything was sinking in. Morgan Freeman had been nothing but kind, yet he had delivered a lesson that cut deeper than any punishment ever could. What happened next, however, would bring Lindsay to tears. Karen exhaled sharply, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Freeman, while we respect your decision, I truly hope you'll reconsider." Morgan Freeman simply smiled, his deep voice as composed as ever. "I've already made my choice." Lindsay remained frozen in place. Her mind raced through the past 10 minutes, replaying every misstep she had made. The way she dismissed him, the way she assumed he didn't belong, the way she refused to double-check. And now, she was standing in front of an icon who had just taught her the most painful yet necessary lesson of her life. Before Karen could push the matter any further, a voice from first class spoke up. "If Mr. Freeman won't return to first class, then neither will I." Heads turned. It was the businessman from seat 2C, the one who had been shaking his head earlier. He unbuckled his seatbelt, grabbed his carry-on, and began making his way down the aisle. A murmur swept through the cabin. "What's going on? Is he serious?" Another passenger stood up, a middle-aged woman from 4B. "I'll switch seats too," she said, grabbing her bag. "It doesn't feel right sitting there while he's here." Lindsay's mouth parted in shock. One by one, passengers from first class began unbuckling their seatbelts, picking up their belongings, and walking toward economy. Karen's eyes widened. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats." But they didn't listen. Instead, a movement started. The first-class passengers, those who had paid thousands for luxury, willingly gave up their seats. Some swapped with economy passengers. Some squeezed into the middle rows next to complete strangers. Some simply sat down on the empty aisle floors, smiling at Morgan as they did. A sense of unity rippled through the plane. Even some economy passengers were getting emotional. The mother sitting next to Morgan wiped her eyes. "I've never seen anything like this before," she whispered. Karen was losing control. "Everyone, please." Morgan chuckled and held up a hand. "Relax, Karen," he said smoothly. "It looks like you're witnessing something bigger than all of us." Lindsay's throat tightened. She had started this mess, and yet somehow it had turned into something beautiful. People weren't just standing up for Morgan Freeman. They were standing up against judgment, against assumptions, against the invisible barriers that separated people by status, wealth, and power. One of the flight attendants from the back hurried forward, her face pale. "Karen," she whispered urgently, "we just got word from the captain. The airline CEO saw the video." Karen's stomach dropped. "What?" Lindsay's heart pounded. "The CEO is furious. He's demanding an immediate response." Karen turned slowly to Morgan, her mind spinning. If this escalated any further, it wouldn't just be a public relations disaster. It could mean serious trouble for the airline itself. Lindsay, still paralyzed, felt the overwhelming weight of what she had done. And in that moment, something broke inside her. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Mr. Freeman," she said softly, her voice trembling. He turned his gaze to her, his expression kind but firm. I am so sorry," she choked out. "I didn't just make a mistake. I made a judgment, and it was wrong. I don't expect you to forgive me, But I just wanted you to know that. The cabin was silent. Morgan studied her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and patted her gently on the shoulder. Apology accepted, he said, his voice warm. Just promise me one thing. Lindsay wiped at her eyes quickly. Anything. Remember this moment, he said softly. And make sure you never let it happen again. A single tear slipped down Lindsay's cheek. She nodded. The lesson was learned. But what happened next would be even more astonishing. The weight of Morgan Freeman's words lingered in the air like an unshakable truth. Lindsay wiped her eyes, her heart still hammering against her ribs. She had made a mistake. One that had spiraled into something far greater than she ever could have imagined. Karen Matthews, still clutching the tablet, was now focused on something else. The growing notifications on the airline's internal communication system. The situation had escalated beyond just the passengers. The CEO had seen the viral video, and he was furious. Karen turned toward the flight attendant who had brought the news. What exactly did he say? The attendant swallowed hard. He wants to speak to you. Immediately. Karen's face paled. A direct order from the CEO mid-flight? This was bad. Very bad. Lindsay wasn't sure how much worse things could get. But then Karen turned to her and said, "You're coming with me." Her stomach dropped. Back in the first-class galley, Karen activated the secure communication channel with the airline's headquarters. The small screen flickered, and within seconds, the furious face of Douglas Wilkins, CEO of the airline, appeared. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. "Karen," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Would you care to explain why one of the most respected men in America is sitting in economy on one of my airline's planes?" Karen straightened. "Sir, there was a misunderstanding with the seating arrangements. Douglas held up a hand, silencing her. His eyes shifted to Lindsay, who felt herself shrinking under his gaze. "You must be Lindsay," he said, his tone clipped. "I assume you're the one responsible for this disaster?" Lindsay's throat went dry. Her entire career flashed before her eyes. She had only been with the airline for 2 years. She had worked hard. But one mistake, one massive public mistake, could cost her everything. She forced herself to speak. "Yes, sir. I didn't check the manifest properly. I assumed he wasn't on the first-class list, and I made a terrible mistake." Douglas's face remained unreadable. Then, to her shock, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said, his voice losing a fraction of its sharpness, "at least you admit it." Karen hesitated. "Sir, if I may." Douglas cut her off again. "I want 2 things to happen," he said firmly. "First, Mr. Freeman is to be offered every courtesy possible, whether he chooses to remain in economy or return to first class. He is to leave this flight with nothing but the highest level of respect." Karen nodded quickly. "Of course, sir." Lindsay felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe she wouldn't be fired. But then Douglas fixed her with a hard stare. "And second," he continued, "I want Lindsay to personally apologize to every single passenger on that flight." Lindsay's breath caught in her throat. "Every passenger?" Lindsay took a deep breath and stepped out of the galley. Her stomach twisted into knots as she faced the long stretch of the plane's cabin, filled with passengers who had witnessed her worst moment. She had no choice. She had to own up to what she had done. As she walked back toward economy, she felt dozens of eyes locking onto her. Some were curious. Some were judgmental. Some, like the mother sitting next to Morgan Freeman, seemed empathetic. But Lindsay wasn't looking for sympathy. She stopped at the first row and forced herself to speak. "Excuse me, everyone," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I need to say something." The murmurs died down. Passengers turned toward her, waiting. Lindsay swallowed. "My name is Lindsay, and I was the flight attendant who asked Mr. Freeman to leave first class. I made a terrible mistake today, and I need to apologize. Not just to him, but to all of you." Silence. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her. "I assumed something that wasn't true," she continued. "I let a judgment get in the way of my duty, to treat every passenger with respect. And I didn't just disrespect Mr. Freeman. I disrespected all of you by letting that kind of thinking exist in this space. That's not who I want to be. And I am truly, truly sorry. A deep breath. I know that words aren't enough, she admitted. But I hope, at the very least, that I can earn back the trust one lost today. A long pause. Then, to her surprise, someone started clapping. She turned. It was Morgan Freeman. A slow, rhythmic applause. Then, one by one, other passengers joined in. The mother next to him. The businessman from first class. The elderly woman who had been shaking her head earlier. The cabin filled with soft, warm applause. Lindsay's throat tightened. She hadn't expected this. She had braced for anger, for scorn, for passengers demanding she be fired on the spot. But instead, they had accepted her apology. Morgan Freeman smiled at her. Takes a lot of courage to own up to a mistake, he said. I respect that. Lindsay felt something inside her shift. For the first time since this ordeal had begun, she felt hope. Karen, watching from a distance, nodded approvingly. It wasn't over yet. She still had to apologize to every passenger. But the hardest part was done. Little did she know, the biggest surprise of the flight was still to come. As Lindsay continued her apology tour, she felt a shift in the atmosphere of the plane. The icy stares had softened. The passengers, instead of scowling at her, now met her with understanding nods and even small smiles. She made her way row by row, stopping at each passenger, looking them in the eye, and offering a heartfelt apology. Some passengers responded with a simple, "It's okay," while others gave her words of encouragement. By the time she reached the last row, her nerves had settled. She had done what she was asked. She had done what was right. But just as she was about to return to the galley, she heard Morgan Freeman's deep, unmistakable voice call out, "Lindsay." She turned to face him. Morgan studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I have a proposition for you," he said. Lindsay blinked, confused. "A proposition?" Morgan nodded. "Tell me something. How long have you been a flight attendant?" 2 years, she answered hesitantly. "And before that?" "I worked in customer service. But I always wanted to travel, so I trained to become a flight attendant." Morgan nodded, as if he were piecing together a puzzle. "Well, Lindsay," he said, "it seems to me that today, you've learned one of the most important lessons in customer service. A lesson that many never learn at all." Lindsay frowned slightly. "Which is?" "That humility and respect matter more than anything else," he said. "More than money, more than status, more than power. And the fact that you stood in front of this plane and admitted your mistake tells me something about your character." Lindsay swallowed. "People make mistakes," Morgan continued, "but not everyone learns from them. You did." A long pause, and then he said something that shocked everyone on the plane. "I happen to be working on a documentary about human behavior, the way people perceive status, power, and respect," Morgan said. "And I think your story, What Happened Today, perfectly illustrates that." Lindsay's mouth fell open. "I'd like to invite you to be a part of it," he said simply. "Not as someone who was in the wrong, but as someone who learned, changed, and grew from the experience." The entire cabin gasped. Lindsay felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. "Me?" she stammered. I'm just a flight attendant." "I'm not. You're a human being," Morgan interrupted, smiling. "And that's all that matters." Lindsay looked around, still stunned. Karen looked equally speechless. The passengers, on the other hand, were grinning. And for the first time that day, Lindsay felt something she hadn't felt in hours. Hope. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. Lindsay stood frozen, trying to process Morgan Freeman's words. A documentary? About her? The same woman who had just made one of the biggest mistakes of her career? She glanced around the cabin. Dozens of passengers were still staring at her, some with looks of astonishment, others with admiration. Even Karen, her supervisor, was speechless. I don't know what to say," Lindsay admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Morgan chuckled. "Well, I suggest you start with yes. The passengers laughed, the tension in the air finally breaking. Lindsay's hands trembled as she thought about what this meant. She had never been in front of a camera before. She was just an ordinary woman doing her job, except today, she had failed at it in the most public way possible. And yet, Morgan wasn't offering her this opportunity because of her mistake. He was offering it because she had owned up to it. She took a deep breath. Mr. Freeman, Please, he interrupted, smiling warmly. Call me Morgan. Lindsay nodded, her heart pounding. Morgan, I don't know if I deserve this. Morgan's expression turned serious. Do you know what makes a person deserving? He asked. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn. And today you proved that. Lindsay swallowed hard. He was right. Today had been the most difficult day of her career, but she had grown from it. Maybe, just maybe, her story could help others learn the same lesson. Finally, she gave a small nod. Yes, she said softly. Then stronger, yes, I'd be honored. The passengers erupted in applause. Karen, still looking stunned, managed to give a small smile. Morgan grinned. Well then, Lindsay, it looks like your journey is just beginning. Lindsay let out a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. She had started this flight believing it would be just another routine day. But by the time the plane landed, her entire life would be different. And the biggest surprise was still yet to come. As the plane came to a complete stop, Lindsay took a deep breath. She had faced her mistake, apologized, and somehow walked away from it with an incredible opportunity. But she still felt the weight of everything that had happened. Would her airline punish her? Would she still have a job tomorrow? Passengers stood up, retrieving their bags from the overhead bins. Many smiled at Lindsay as they passed, some giving her an encouraging nod, others murmuring, "Good luck!" As Morgan Freeman slowly stood and gathered his things, Lindsay hesitated. There was one more thing she needed to say. "Mr. Freeman," she caught herself. "Morgan," he turned, raising an eyebrow. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said earnestly. "Not just for the opportunity, but for not being angry, for understanding, for teaching me something I'll never forget." Morgan smiled. "You know, Lindsay, I've played a lot of wise men in movies. But the truth is, wisdom isn't about being born knowing things. It's about listening, learning, and growing. And today, you proved you're wise beyond your years." Lindsay felt a warmth spread through her chest. Morgan leaned in slightly. "And between you and me," he said in a low voice, "I really do prefer the legroom in first class." Lindsay burst out laughing. Morgan chuckled and gave her a small nod before heading toward the exit. Just as he reached the jet bridge, Lindsay's radio crackled. "Lindsay, come to the front before you leave. Karen." Lindsay's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was she about to be fired? Taking a deep breath, she made her way to the front of the plane, where Karen stood with her arms crossed. Lindsay braced herself. "Lindsay," Karen started. "Today was eventful." Lindsay nodded, waiting for the inevitable bad news. Karen exhaled. "I was going to write up a report on what happened, but after seeing how you handled it, how you owned up to it and turned it into something meaningful." A pause. "I'm letting it go." Lindsay's eyes widened. "Really?" Karen smirked. "Really? Just, maybe next time, check the first-class manifest before you assume someone doesn't belong there." Lindsay laughed, relieved beyond words. "I promise." Karen nodded toward the door. "Now go on. You have a documentary to prepare for." Lindsay stepped off the plane, the weight of the day finally lifting. She had walked onto this flight as just another flight attendant. She walked off it knowing that her life would never be the same. And as she exited the terminal, she couldn't help but smile. Because in the end, what had started as the worst day of her career had turned into the best day of her life.